Welcome to Liberty Unlocked. I'm Don Watkins. So, no big intro today. We're dropping this one a little bit early because Ayn Rand is trending on Twitter right now for somewhat dubious reasons. And in this discussion, I talked to Ben Bayer, who is a philosopher, expert on Ayn Rand's philosophy, and we get deep into a lot of how he journeyed from somebody who was very invested, let's say, in alternative ideas and was eventually persuaded of Ayn Rand's approach to philosophy. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, particularly in a context where people treat her as like a non-serious thinker who only appeals to teenagers, whereas the reality is that people who think deeply about philosophy have been persuaded by her arguments, and the people who dismiss her rarely even know her conclusions. So with that, we'll dive right in. Remember, as always, the best way to support the show is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk to you soon. Well, awesome, Ben. Thanks for doing the show. So the way I got introduced to you, I actually think has larger lessons, but it was a little embarrassing, which is this is the early days, relatively early days of the internet. I think the very early 2000s. And I was blogging. And in those days, I had never met anybody I had interacted with online. It kind of felt like just talking to fake people. And so I just, said whatever I felt like. And I remember saying something. You were blogging anonymously in those days, and I won't say what the blog was unless you want to, but I was like, oh, that guy is, and I forget exactly what my dismissive comment was, but it was something insulting and saying you didn't understand Ayn Rand's philosophy. And you wrote me back an email which was explaining, oh, well, I'm actually a philosophy student, and I've studied at the Objectivist Academic Center and so on. And I just remember like the blood draining from my face as I realized, oh my God, people I respect might be reading what I write. And it was a really good lesson because I think I was much more thoughtful and responsible about what I said after that point. But I'm curious if you remember that.
I actually don't remember it. I don't know if I actually did know that much about objectivism as I was claiming back then, but I did do a lot of anonymous blogging, and it's likely that we would have had that kind of exchange if what you describe had happened. Sure.
But yeah, which is I think maybe it's different now because this is before Facebook and like people had identifiable identities tied to their communications, and I'm intrigued by the fact of like how differently people will behave online, even when their identity is known, than they will in real life. Like you almost feel like, do you remember the Jerry Seinfeld joke about like being in the taxi and the taxi drivers going all over the place, but you feel like you're watching it on TV? Like, oh, that would be dangerous. Glad I'm, not subject to that. And I feel like there's something similar with writing online.
Yeah, I used to do quite a lot of anonymous writing. I think tried to restrain myself from the sorts of things that people are these days apt to do, the kind of drive-by trolling behavior. Though there were, I think, still occasions when I wrote things I never would have written if I had been doing it under my current name. And now that I write everything, up front with my name on it, it certainly has a lot of implications because you know that it's going out there for the whole world to see, and your name's going to be associated with it, and so you have to think a lot about, is this something I'm going to want to stand by a few years from now? How important is this issue to me, and am I willing to be proud of what I'm saying? And yeah, I mean, I think that more people should think about what they write online in just those same regards, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, in part, I'm so much right now focused on getting more people to speak out and hopefully speak out effectively. But there is something to say for like you can do much more damage than you can achieve something in any given tweet or any given Facebook post, certainly to your reputation, let alone the reputation of your ideas. I mean, one of the things I had was over a decade at the Ayn Rand Institute where like I basically would have to answer to the person paying me a check for anything ridiculous that I wrote. And I think that got me safely through my 20s and well into my 30s. And so now I think I have a much more, like I've definitely stopped myself before hitting post on, and I don't get into personal attacks so much, but it will usually be some kind of misguided attempt at humor in an intellectual context. And that's always high risk because humor is one of those things that can be easily misinterpreted, and you're assuming agreement almost always. And so if you're interested in persuasion, which I am, humor, you have to be a lot more thoughtful about where it belongs and where it doesn't.
Yeah, the ratio of my initiated Facebook posts to actually published Facebook posts has gone way, way up in the last 5 to 10 years, where I start out writing something and maybe I'm going to post an article, maybe I'm just going to post a comment, and then I end up saying, why am I writing this? What am I trying to accomplish by doing it? Is this just to show off in some way? Is this just to be snarky? Is this just to piss somebody off? If so, what's the point of doing that? So yeah, I definitely think that it pays, and I think you wrote an article or did a comment about this recently, that it's helpful to think about why you're doing this. What communicative purpose are you actually trying to accomplish? And I think very few people these days actually go through that thought process and think about, well, am I actually trying to change someone's mind by saying something? Because if you were actually trying to change someone's mind, you wouldn't go about doing it the way that these people are often doing it. I find there's a lot of venting. People use social media just to vent without any thought as to what their venting will accomplish. And I get that to the extent that there's so many things to vent about, right? And I have lots of things I want to vent about, but when you're venting in public, yeah, you need to think about what's the impact of it going to be. Are you being purposeful in your communication? And I think there's a lot of work to be done. Someday I would like to write maybe an article on being purposeful in one's communication. There's a lot that we can learn from Francisco d'Anconia's question, why, what for, in application to this skill, just like in application to so many others. So
you have one of the most intriguing stories. So like podcasters are probably sick of me telling this, but like, my story is basically, I went from like some vague dabblings and trying to understand a handful of philosophers like Sartre and Nietzsche when I was like 13 or 14, but then discovered Ayn Rand when I was 15. And I really had no period where I disagreed with the views I currently hold. I didn't know as much, and I went off the rails in certain ways, for a long time trying to get clarity on all the pieces of it, but I never had a fundamentally different view. And part of that is frustrating for me or it certainly was in the past, because it took me a long time to understand the worldviews of the people I was going to try to engage with and convince of my ideas. Whereas your journey worked a little bit differently. So how did you start out? When did you first cultivate your worldview, and specifically politics, but not only that?
I think it is an interesting story, and I'll preface it actually by saying I think it's the only reason that this is of interest to anybody. Like, why does anybody care about my life story? The only reason I can think of to make it interesting to people is because it does actually relate a lot to how I think about communication. When I look at a piece someone else has written, or when I look at the things I'm writing for myself, I try to ask myself, would this have helped me change my mind from my other older views? And what process did I actually go through when I changed my mind? Because I did change my mind in a big way. And so I have kind of the perspective of, I've been on the other side. I know what it's like to be on the other side. I know what it takes, at least in my own personal case, I know what it took to change my mind. That's often the standard that I use to judge. Will something change someone else's mind that I'm writing or that someone else is writing? So yeah, I started out in life, I was raised by a family of Catholic Democrats. So
Fair enough.
Kind of religious left, if you want to put it that way. And obviously, I at some point made the transition to a secular, non-leftist objectivist. So there were a number of factors that influenced my worldview prior to my discovering objectivism. Part of it was just my family. Part of it was my friends at school. I hung out with kind of nerdy theater forensics types who, kind of goes with the artsy intellectual territory to be left of center, I think, and that was influential on me in a number of ways.
And what age would you have said you actually started having political views?
Probably sometime in late junior high, early high school. And that then really reached a head in high school when I got into debate. And I was doing both what they call policy debate and Lincoln Douglas debate, where Lincoln Douglas debate is the more philosophical kind.
That's right. No, now I remember the second time when we really started interacting, which is you were involved in the Ayn Rand Institute, giving feedback and doing stuff for people who wanted to use Ayn Rand's ideas in debate.
Yeah.
And I went heavy into that for a year until I realized, oh, all these people actually don't care about ideas. Almost everybody I met liked the chess game. They liked the competition. I said, yeah, that's not for me.
Yeah, and that's I think, part of what appealed to me about it at first as well. It was a trophy I could win and something I could put on my resume, but I really did start to enjoy just actually the process of argumentation and doing research. And in the course of doing that, I certainly encountered a whole variety of positions on different controversial issues. And so I would say by the time I was sophomore in high school, going into junior year, I was pretty far left. I was definitely an environmentalist. I was probably some kind of multiculturalist who was very concerned with the oppressed peoples around the world. I was sympathetic to feminism on a number of fronts. And this was, bolstered by kinds of arguments that I had to make when you're in debate. They make you argue both sides of the resolution, and so you get steeped in giving arguments for various left-wing positions. Of course, you also do the opposite, and that was relevant for me because, long story short, I'll try to keep it short. I'd gotten so far my senior year that I considered myself to be a Rawlsian. So I had read John Rawls' Theory of Justice as part of my debate research. I even went to a tournament at Harvard where I used Rawls's arguments on both sides of the resolution. I was so enamored of Rawls at that point. And
makes total sense. I mean, it's devoid of content. So
I mean, that's true. Yeah, but I thought the whole veil of ignorance, original position, his difference principle of justice were kind of sophisticated, and yet there was an interesting thought experiment connected with it, and I enjoyed the variety of ways you could apply that theory. So that's how far I got. I got even to the point where that same year, senior year, I'd written a lot of columns in a student newspaper, and there was a friend of mine who was a libertarian of sorts, who wrote an article arguing for libertarianism in the school newspaper, and I wrote an article opposing it in the student newspaper, why you should reject individual freedom because of Rawls's difference principle.
Oh, wow. That's,
I'm sure was just, I'm sure that the student audience really ate that one up. But that's how far,
well,
that's how far I was.
I was,
And
I was editor of the opinion section of my student newspaper, and you can imagine what they were bombarded with. It was a combination of like bad regurgitated objectivism and really like potty humorous columns that I came up with. So it was quite the ride that they went on.
So that was as far as I got, and then it all started to change when I heard about the essay contest for the Ayn Rand Institute. Now, I had heard of Ayn Rand before that, so I had encountered Ayn Rand's arguments in debate rounds.
That's interesting.
At one point, I heard someone reference Philosophy Who Needs It, and I thought it was kind of a dismissive title, like Philosophy Who Needs It? But this is back in the day when Barnes & Noble was just setting up branches all over the country, and we never had a proper bookstore in my hometown in Wisconsin before. And I went to the Barnes & Noble, and I was browsing this huge philosophy section, and I saw there's a lot of Ayn Rand books. And so, oh, that's that Ayn Rand lady I keep hearing about in debate rounds. So I picked up a copy of Philosophy Who Needs It. And
hey, that was my first too.
And I read the whole thing mainly because I knew there were going to be arguments critical of other philosophers in the book. And I needed to have arguments that were critical of other philosophers for my debate rounds, including of Rawls. Even though I had gotten so used to running Rawls in my arguments, there's an Untitled Letter, which is critical of Rawls in Philosophy Who Needs It. So I read the whole thing. I didn't really have yet a sense of what objectivism was or what her philosophy was. I knew I had heard rumors about her views through other channels, but I still found the book really interesting, especially the first essay, especially the essay about how everybody has a philosophy, everybody needs a philosophy, and this was just a compelling introduction to philosophy to me. And I didn't know what I thought about her philosophy, but I thought this is the most interesting perspective on why we should care about philosophy that I've ever read. And so then when it came time, when I heard about the essay contest, I was a senior. I was waiting to go to, I was applying to colleges and waiting to hear back about which colleges I get into, and I needed money for colleges. So I thought, hey, I'll write this essay for the essay contest. I don't agree with this objectivism stuff, but I know philosophy, and I've been reading other philosophers. I can probably write this slam dunk critical essay about the Fountainhead, explaining why it's wrong, and I'll win the essay contest, and then I'll be able to pay for college. And so I started reading it, and I actually never got around to submitting an essay because I was just too busy. But it didn't matter, because by the time the essay deadline came around April 15th, I was already halfway through the book, and I was hooked. And I was hooked in spite of myself. I had, first of all, never read a novel before, which I was so gripped by on a personal level. I'd read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and I thought that was interesting from a psychological perspective. But I didn't care about the characters in Crime and Punishment as I had about the characters in The Fountainhead. And a lot of people, when they read The Fountainhead, they say they really identify with Rourke because they see themselves as a kind of put upon by society. But my experience with the book wasn't anything like that. It was that I identified with Peter Keating, and this scared me to death.
Yeah.
Because I didn't like Peter Keating. I really admired Rourke. I liked him from the beginning, even though he was like no one I had ever seen before. I could tell you all kinds of details about why I identified with Peter Keating. I won't go into them unless you want to, but it's basically I saw myself as much too concerned with kind of social prestige and, scoring points and gold stars from, teachers and things like this. And I didn't like the fact that I liked these things. And so by the time I was done with the Fountainhead, it just completely shook me up. And that's when I realized, no, there's something wrong with the values that I've had up until this point. And so I started exploring other Ayn Rand books, and basically the rest is history. There's a lot more to the story than that, but
sure. So I think it's really intriguing that like that was your experience, and I mean I think actually like it's great that a lot of people resonate with Rourke. I think a lot of people, if they were more honest, would admit like I see a lot of Peter Keating in myself, or a lot, some of the other characters in her novels. I think it's interesting though that for somebody who was kind of politically and philosophically aware, it was the more like ethical, how I live my life, and even almost it sounds like the psychological parts of the being concerned with other people's approval rather than Ayn Rand has some great argument for independence. To what extent was the politics part of it, which was obviously a big transition for you? How much was that a struggle versus once you just got attracted to this idea of like living an independent life through my own personal values, did you think, okay, the politics just sort of makes sense now?
It was not quite as easy of a leap as that. So, and it's hard for me to reconstruct the whole history, but I do remember sometime late in my senior year, I don't think I had finished The Fountainhead yet. I wrote another newspaper column for my student newspaper where when I read it now, I can see how I was struggling because I wrote an article about how your parents and your teachers expect you to study hard and do well in school, presumably so that you can be successful in life. But I was also noticing that they were telling people to do a bunch of service projects to put on their resume to get into college. And the people who I knew were doing that, to me, they didn't seem very sincere. It seemed like they were doing it just to put it on their resume. And I thought, well, if the idea is that we're supposed to do service because serving others is more important, well, why is it that you want us to study so hard to get successful later in life? It didn't cohere to me.
Was this before or after you had read The Fountainhead?
I think it's during. So I didn't yet know like the full takeaway message. I had, a glimmer of what it was. But it was enough of a glimmer for me to start thinking there's some kind of inconsistencies or incoherency in the worldview that everybody else wants me to adopt, that I've adopted. And so then when I finished The Fountainhead, and especially after I started reading the nonfiction, I started then applying those same kind of standards to the political views that I had held. And so, for instance, and Rawls is actually a really good example here because if you know enough Rawls, he's got two principles of justice. There's the first, which is the principle of equal basic liberties for everyone. And then there's the second one, which is the difference principle, which says that the inequalities that exist in society need to work to the advantage of the least well-off. And if you know those two principles, Rawls has ways of trying to reconcile them with each other, but especially after you're introduced to Ayn Rand's philosophy, you start looking at that and saying, wait, how can you have equal liberties for each person if you're going to redistribute wealth from one person to help out another? Isn't that violating their liberty in some way? And so that was a kind of a revelation for me, especially because I took really seriously the first principle of justice, the way that he put it. I took really
Which most
seriously the
people
idea.
basically skip over. Like that, like if you read accounts of Rawls, aside from like dense academic ones, the focus is always on principle too. And even Rawls, like
Yeah.
he doesn't spend that much time on one.
Right. And so I said that I'd gotten pretty far left, but I think I was always a liberal left winger. So I took civil rights and free speech kinds of issues pretty seriously.
Do you recall any dissatisfaction that you had prior to reading The Fountainhead with your worldview? Were there any kind of issues where you thought this isn't similar to what you just described about the service thing, where you felt like this isn't fully satisfactory, or maybe in the debates you felt like there's shaky ground that I'm on here, or did it feel very secure?
No, it didn't feel secure. And one of the other factors here is that my debate coach was actually a libertarian. And he and I got into debates all the time about the very subjects that we were debating about. And he's a smart guy, really smart guy, not an objectivist, but I mean, I learned a lot from him about argumentation. And we'd get into these debates about about free trade and about economic liberties. And he would make these arguments where he would basically say, well, if freedom is good, if liberty is good, why is it any different when you're talking about economic liberties as opposed to personal, social liberties, etc.? And I had a really hard time answering those arguments. And so, and it's the same issue really with the contradiction in Rawls. And so once I got this very different moral worldview coming out of the Fountainhead, and then after that, looking at the objectivist ethics and other nonfiction work, I started thinking, no, there really is a contradiction there. And if you really take personal or social liberties, as they call them, seriously, there isn't a really principled reason not to apply it to economic liberties as well. And so I that's part of the reason. I mean, I think that has implications for communication and persuasion, because I think there are a lot of people out there who start from a similar position as I did, where they do take those liberty issues, those personal liberty issues seriously. And if you can build a bridge to them and say, hey, why is it any different when you're talking about economic liberty? I think you can make headway with those kinds of people. At least it worked with me. I mean, it really sealed the deal when I got to Atlas Shrugged, because in that book, you get this really intimate portrayal of the inner lives of business people like Dagny and Reardon. And you start to realize, wait a second, these are creative, imaginative people, and they're trying to build things in the same way that, you know, artists are trying to create and writers are trying to create. And so why wouldn't you want to protect their freedom to create and innovate in just the same way that you want to protect the rights of the artist or the writer to do the same? And so there was that, again, that kind of psychological angle on these kinds of people that really opened my eyes to this different way of thinking about politics.
I think there's a wider point here, which is really important, which is that people, unless they're really scummy, like they have real positive reasons why they're attracted to a certain set of ideas. And like, if you're associating the left with, which I think a lot of people do, with, on the one hand, not being the right and all their problems, so that's good, but also like, and certainly in the 90s when we were growing up, this was still, I think, even much stronger than today, associated with freedom of speech, with personal liberty, with freedom in the social realm. Like,
not so much anymore, but yeah. Yeah,
not as much anymore. Though I think the not the right still plays a big role in attracting good people to the left. The recognizing that there's those positive values, that's what you're appealing to, right? And part of what you're doing strategically or persuasively is saying, like if you really care about those, what else does that imply? like what does valuing individual liberty really consist of? And as you pointed out, you couldn't value individual liberty. First of all, like, I mean, to take the starkest case, if you had, Ayn Rand really stresses this point that without property rights, no other rights are possible. But even with like semi-property rights, where beyond your basic standard of living, you're chopped down until the worst person, the worst off person is at the same level, then then we can tolerate some inequality. Like the focusing on the actual positives that people are seeing in it, rather than just be dismissive and say, you're deluded, now come over here and I'll give you the holy grail of knowledge. Like, I think that kind of respect for people is both moral but effective in terms of persuasion.
Yeah, and in my case, one of the other things that did it was the deeper philosophic perspective that Ayn Rand brought to the issue of rights from the perspective actually of her metaphysics. That essay in Philosophy Who Needs It about censorship local and express, where she talks about how the liberals want to enslave your body and the conservatives want to enslave your mind, and they're just two different sides of the mind-body dichotomy. That was really mind-blowing to me. And I realized that part of my reason for distinguishing types of freedoms and types of liberty, the kind that I care about, the kind that I don't, definitely related to kind of mind-body issues, where I had like this reverence for the spirit, but not for the body. And that's why I cared about one kind of personal and social freedom, not the economic freedom.
Say something about that, because I actually think this is one of the most underappreciated big ideas in objectivism. That is, like in the fiction, I mean, the soul-body dichotomy is at the core of Atlas Shrugged. I mean, it's one of the central issues, and yet it's one of the ones I don't hear as talked about, and I don't think people are getting the cash value out of understanding her view that like they're united as much. And so I'm curious as to, like, just in your own living of your life or thinking about issues that are interesting to you, where do you see that perspective on people falling victim to that dichotomy, and then the benefit of being able to see the unity of mind-body?
Well, the reason that I thought of this is because you mentioned something about the importance of property rights. And it's certainly, there's a view that if you regard material wealth as unimportant because it's material, then you're going to be more on a premise of the freedom that we have with regard to material goods is not so important. And that was the kind of perspective that I had. I thought I had a kind of anti-materialist perspective. And so I didn't see property rights as something especially important for people's liberties. But if you think that, well, wait a minute, but these artists and intellectuals, they need to have their paint to paint their canvases, and their paper and pens to write their treatises. What are the canvases and the treatises, or the canvases and the paper that business people write upon? Well, they write upon the material goods that they work up into. They work on the resources that they work up into material goods. And I think there's a real obliviousness on the left today to the idea that what business creators are trying to do is to build cool things that they want to bring into reality. There's this assumption that they want to just sit on piles of cash, which at best they will use to, buy yachts where they can have parties with rap stars. I don't know. But I think the reality is that the vast bulk of anybody's fortune is reinvested into their business, or invested into other people's businesses so that they can create things. There's just there's no perspective that, look, people are trying to build cool things, but they've got to be able to build them to do that. And building requires property, which requires property rights.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, this probably doesn't get to the deepest essential, but I do think it's interesting that, like, the more that an artist is connected to the need for, like, capital, the more pro-commerce they tend to be. Like, if you think about musicians, I notice a much more positive, I'm not thinking like Bob Dylan strumming with his guitar, but like if I think of hip hop artists and even rock artists who recognize that, like, I need a studio that, everything costs 20,000, 30 grand to do. There's an appreciation that I can't do my art apart from commerce. And that also means reaching my fans and being able to sell to them and so on. And so, whereas if you take people who are like, I sit with my typewriter and bat out my novels that nobody reads, or, put paint in a canvas. There's more of that. I don't know if that's just an accident of, but I definitely see, like, Ayn Rand has this point in Atlas Shrugged about, the artist and the businessman are fundamentally similar in that they're both, creative. And, like, having spent time with both artists and businessmen, you notice a lot of the same way that their mind works, the things they get excited about. And a lot of what they're getting excited about is projecting cool futures, right? So it's making cool things, but it's really about how do we create a cool future, an amazing future, something that excites me and is better than what we have today. And that's really, like, the core mentality that, like, is similar between them. But I think both sides tend to have a caricature of the other side, right? Like, the businessman sits on piles of cash. The artist is basically somebody who just, smears stuff and doesn't think about what they're doing and expects that, like, that they shouldn't have to work for a living, essentially. So one of the things that I think is interesting is about your trajectory is, like, you were a writer. Like, I mean, you were writing all throughout this journey. And how important was writing to you, just getting clarity on the ideas that you were wrestling with?
Well, I wish I had thought of it in those terms earlier on. I did when I was first writing, I didn't think of it as a tool for clarity, for my own thinking or anybody's. I saw it more along the lines of what we were talking about earlier, people's perspective on social media. I saw it as a way of venting a view, in my case, in much more prolix way than anyone needed to. But and when I look at my old writing, it was awful. When I look at writing from just a couple of years ago, sometimes I think it's awful. So it obviously takes some time to get perspective on that. But I will say this, that I do like writing a whole lot. I find it excruciatingly difficult sometimes, but it's the most enjoyable, excruciating thing that I know how to do. And I think it's because I really like having a final product that I can, look at as the product of my efforts. It's something I like more about writing than I do about teaching. Because with teaching, you never have quite the same kind of finished product. Even I mean, I guess you have a lecture if it's been recorded, but the real product you're aiming at there is the students, and you never know what they're going to do with it. Now, of course, there's a similar relationship to the audience with an article that you're writing, but I don't know if that's quite what you were looking for in as a perspective.
Well, no, I'm just always interested in what compels people to write and what they get out of it. Because I couldn't even tell you. I think I was similar to you in the sense that, like, my motivations for like, it was something I always did, and I just enjoyed the process. But if you had asked me, like, top of mind early on, what was the goal? I would say the top of mind goal was, like, I'm going to change everybody in the universe's mind so that now they're right, just like me. I also think that part of it was just under the surface was like I felt just this creative energy and I wanted to get out and like project something outside of myself, right? Like create something. And one of the hard parts was that when you're young and you have that creative energy, yet you don't actually have much to communicate. And I just remember sitting in my dorm room one night specifically and just feeling like I need to write something, and I literally had nothing to say. But that like that was so core to my development. Part of my motivation to learn certain ideas was so I could write about them, not just so I could live by them. And like I think I'm just gonna create a theory right on the spot that like if you are interested in writing and communication, I think you can learn ideas much faster because you're forced to like articulate them, make use of them, give them shape externally rather than just read them and go, yeah, that makes sense.
I agree with that completely. It's been my experience more than a number of occasions where I start out with an idea. I want to try to defend it in writing. I start to try to defend it in writing, and I quickly run up against a bunch of obstacles where, well, but there's this objection that somebody could make, and I could maybe try to answer that objection, but then if I have to do that, it's going to complicate the whole message, so I can't really put this into an article. In fact, I was just struggling with this last night on a new project, and I haven't worked that one out yet. But yeah, I mean, sometimes there are complicated questions which you are pretty sure in principle can be addressed, but if it takes a lot of complicated argumentation to address them, then you wonder, have I gone down the wrong path somehow in the way I'm thinking about it?
That's a really important point. Like I found that the best thinkers, it's like we're both friendly. I mean, you currently work with Onkar Ghate. And what always impressed me was not that they would have an answer to things necessarily, but that it was always much simpler, or almost always much simpler than I had it. Or they would take like something that it would have taken me 3 pages to try to articulate. He would have one line that would just deal with it. And writing can certainly expose that. And I definitely have a standing order for myself that if I notice that this is seeming too hard to make the argument, I'm probably not on the right track. Like it doesn't mean that you can reduce everything to a tweet or a soundbite. But it does mean that, like, I think if you're framing things right, the correct argument should feel very straightforward and not like somebody has to follow 20 if-thens.
I agree. Yeah, and Ankar is very good at helping people to untangle these complicated problems by helping to dramatically simplify things down to their essentials. And sometimes that just means throw this project out because you can't get into these complications. I'm sure you know what it's like since you worked at ARI as well. But I mean, I've had lots of my writing projects thrown in the waste bin in the 3 years that I've been working here, either by me or by others. When we realize this isn't going to work because of some complication like that. And so people wonder a lot about the process that goes into deciding on what to write about at ARI. We always get all kinds of feedback from readers saying, why aren't you writing about this? Why aren't you writing about that? You guys should take this position. And the answer is usually something like, well, we write about things that we feel that we know well, that we've studied, that we have clear thoughts on, that we can articulate clearly. And so sometimes there are headlines in the news on some controversial issue where, it makes sense that some people should be writing about these topics, but if we don't have any expertise on them, and we don't think that the people who are writing without expertise are saying anything very enlightening, we simply won't comment, because it won't contribute to any positive communicative purpose, like we were talking about before. If it'll only muddy the waters, what's the point of adding our perspective? So we write on things that have a clear connection to, especially the philosophic topics that we know well. And sometimes that means there'll be big controversies that happen in the news where we won't say anything about it, but that's, I think, on purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I have the view that like picking your battles is a really important part of being persuasive. So if you just take a different case, which is, you're in an office atmosphere, and it's not like one of these places where if you speak out of turn, you're going to be fired or something like that. But nevertheless, ideas will come up from time to time. And let's say your colleagues are mostly, on the left, or they're religious conservatives or something. I think it can often make sense to speak out. But one of the conditions I would say is speak out when you really know the point, not just have a knee-jerk reaction that's wrong. Because it's much better to once every 6 months say something really smart that you can back up and that clarifies something for people or opens a real question in their mind, versus you just getting labeled as, oh, they'll probably put it as, that he's the libertarian who said, he objects to government doing anything. And so I think it's, once you take that into the sphere of now you're publicly trying to embark on a persuasive undertaking or a persuasive career, creating a persuasive organization, then there's no such thing as a knockout blow in the realm of ideas. But insofar as that metaphor evokes, go for when you really think you have an opening. I think picking your battles is incredibly smart, particularly when we're dealing with like the pro-liberty movement, even broader than objectivism, is so small. We have so few resources. The idea that they should be wasted on we should have an opinion about this. No, use them when you come across as smart, thoughtful, and really can make a point that you think will move the ball. And I think that's much more important than being out there on every single issue under the sun.
Yeah, and this relates to a theme that I've stressed in the past. I gave a talk at Ocon back in 2014 or 15, called Spreading Objectivism by Living It. It's up on YouTube. One of the things that I stressed there is that in lots of ways, you are the message, right? It's not what you're saying, it's who you are. There's a million different viewpoints out there in the world. Somebody out there will defend any view you like. Why does anyone listen to any of them? If it's a difficult thing to change your mind about something, especially something like an entire worldview. If you change your worldview, it messes you up. You've wired together this whole system of beliefs, and it's relates to the friends that you hang out with and the career that you pursue, and it's rational to not want to mess that up at the drop of a hat. And so nobody will hear somebody's argument, even if it's a perfectly logical argument, and say, oh, this person just made this perfectly logical argument about my worldview and why it's wrong. Now I guess I'll change my worldview. Nobody does that.
Well,
the most rational people don't do that.
There are people who do that, but those are the people who will go, oh yeah, that's a great point. And then the next day when they have dinner with their Marxist friends, they're like, oh yeah, that's a great point. In other words, they're not trying to build a coherent worldview. But setting that kind of case aside, yeah, anybody who's worth persuading because they're actually trying to get at a view of the world that is true and fits together, then it can't happen overnight. And it's one thing that should encourage is a kind of patience, that I think there's, particularly on social media, but even in real life, there's this, jumping to the charge of, oh, you're evading, I made this perfect argument. Like, you're winning if they're pushing back, because that means they're engaging. And what they're trying to do very often is they're feeling like this guy's or the girl is saying something plausible, and that threatens my whole integrated view of the world. And I need to protect that by trying to poke holes in it. That's exactly what they should be doing if they're ultimately going to go on this journey of changing their worldview.
And the reason that I mentioned that this is important for thinking of yourself as the message is, given that someone's not going to be persuaded just by some argument that you make, what they will be persuaded by, and here by being persuaded, I mean persuaded to change their views about a lot of things. The only thing that's going to incentivize somebody to do that is if you plant a seed. Maybe your argument is so good that it'll plant a seed. Maybe a series of arguments over years will help that seed grow. But they're not going to let that seed grow if they think you are a blowhard. They're not going to take seriously even enough to consider, why is this wrong, a view from somebody who they just see as spouting talking points. So it's only when you're a person that they respect, they might disagree with you, but they see you as admirable, they see you as worthy of emulation. That's when they'll think, well, I'm struggling with this aspect of my thinking. This is a person I respect. I don't think he's right, but he always talks about this book. Maybe I should look at this book. That's how people change their mind.
The way I put it is that ideas don't persuade people. It's ideas as advocated and embodied by people persuade people.
Yeah.
And so, like, the way you put it is perfect. Like, the best foundational thing you can do, and if all you did was this, which was live a life that people find interesting and admirable and respect your thoughtfulness, like, you've done more to win the persuasion game than by, like, studying my stuff even, because at the end of the day, like, that's foundational, particularly when we're talking not just about politics, but definitely when we're talking about ethics. I mean, the idea that, like, I'm going to give you guidance on how to live your life, and I come across, like, not even as, like, irrational or mean, but just weird or like uninspiring or not that successful, probably not going to get off the ground. Like, I'm interested in guidance from how to live on people who seem to be living in a way that I want to enjoy that kind of life.
Yeah.
And no, I think that's really important. We're getting to end, but I can't actually, you might've mentioned this in jest, but I cannot pass up the opportunity to talk about one of our favorite contemporary writers, Michael Connolly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we recently discovered that we were both fans.
Yeah, so I remember I was, it must have just come out, so maybe this was 96, but I remember walking through the grocery store and I saw this novel, The Poet, and I was like, read it was, Edgar Allan Poe, and I was intrigued by Poe at that point. So maybe it was even before 96, because I would have been probably in middle school or maybe my first year of high school. And so I got it, and I've always been a mystery fan and later a thriller fan, but this was on a whole different level of a perfect mystery, but so real, but not real in like a gratuitous gutter sense, but just you had characters with full psychologies and in interesting relationships and action that was totally believable, and yet telling these incredible, on the edge of your seat, can't guess what's going to happen stories. And I haven't read a ton of his stuff. I read the first few Bosch novels, but everything that I encounter by him, I love, because when it comes to like the mystery thriller genre, I want to be surprised, but I want to believe the world. And to me, he does that better than anybody. What is it that attracts you?
Yeah, so I only recently discovered Connolly just this year, after moving to California, and in that time, I have now read, let's see, it's like 15 of his books. Um, and
Love it.
I got into him because, well, I've been on a mystery detective crime novel kick for about 3 or 4 years now. I've been really diving deep into the genre, in part because I sort of want to write a detective story myself. That's a whole other story. But I've been
We'll
just
have
trying
to
to
talk
find.
because that's I don't know if everybody listens to this show knows, but I have my own mystery thriller coming out
I've
next year.
heard about that. I'm very eager to see it.
Connolly was definitely an influence. No insult to him.
Yeah, but it's so I've been just trying to find who's the detective or crime novelist I like the most, that I can try to learn some things from the most. And so far, he's at the top of my list. I discovered him because I had been a fan of The Wire, which was the
my favorite show,
David Simon drama on HBO, and I saw there was this Bosch show on Amazon. I heard that it was based on some books. I thought I would try out an episode or two, and lo and behold, same producer as Bosch, David Overmeyer, and a whole bunch of the same actors. So that was already going to make me watch the show. And once I got a few episodes in, I said, I've got to read some Connolly novels. And so I started out with Black Ice, and I'm now all the way to The Narrows, which he did in 2004. I'm going to finish the whole batch at this point. But the thing that I like the most about the Bosch books is they have almost everything I liked about The Wire and more. So the thing I liked about The Wire was it was each of the seasons of The Wire was a season-length plot arc with very intricate, interesting mystery with well-drawn characters. It's very naturalistic, but it's the kind of naturalism I like. You get to know a place really well, like Baltimore in The Wire. With Connolly and Bosch, it's LA. But with Bosch, it's got all that, and it's got a character, Harry Bosch, who, on top of everything else, has great moral clarity. Right. That's something you don't see in The Wire. So I think the most interesting character, somewhat comparable to Bosch in The Wire, is McNulty, but he's a mess, and he fits the stereotype of so many central figures in crime novels: the hard drinking cop who, in spite of making a mess of his life, still manages to to battle for justice. But with Connolly, Bosch has his demons, but he doesn't let his demons, at least not as far as I've gotten in the series, he doesn't let them get the better of him. And he's also incredibly objective in his thinking. So it's characteristic of one of these stories, that one of the novels, that he'll have a theory he's working on, and then maybe halfway to 2/3 into the novel, his theory is vindicated in the eyes of everybody else, but then he discovers a problem with his theory, right, and he has to correct his mistakes, and then he finally gets the right person in the end. And I think that is, I've never seen that in that kind of depth of intellectual sophistication in a crime novel character until this point. And I think the books are better than the TV show in this regard. You get a lot more inside perspective on the way Bosch thinks. And the plots of the books are better too, because in the TV show, there's trying to string together a bunch of different plots from a bunch of different novels at the same time. But if you like The Wire, you'll like Bosch even better, I think.
Well, yeah, I don't know what my excuse will be, but I'm going to do a whole show, get some people together just to discuss The Wire. I know that Ron Brooke, who's been appeared in this, is a big fan, and a bunch of my other friends, but it's my absolute favorite. And I really like the parallel, because I hadn't connected it to why I like Connolly so much. But it is in the same universe. If I like very realistic things, but elevated and deepened so that you can really, you get more out of it than just like watching a documentary, but you still feel like you're seeing the actual world that you're living in a new way. Man, I could go on about this all day, but you can't.
People,
So
if people would especially want maybe one example of this, if they don't want to like start at the beginning and work all the way through, if you want to see an example of a book of his where you get that deeper perspective on a very realistic situation, read Angel's Flight, which there's a season of the series that's also based on that book. You read this and you look at the state of race relations and civil unrest that we have today. In a lot of ways, it's prophetic. It was written in 1999, and I read it like a month before the riots happened here. And there's a point in the book where one of the characters says, every 30 years or so, LA has to pay for its unresolved tension on the race issue. And I'm thinking,
clock's ticking.
There's a global pandemic and everybody's out of work and locked down. When's this going to happen? And just a month later.
That's incredible. Well, Ben, thanks a lot. Loved having you on. I could do this all day, but you can't. So hopefully we'll talk again in the future, and go to happy writing. May not everything end up in the garbage can.